So when Jeff originally asked me to preach, he had given me the passage actually after this one. It's the do not worry passage, and it talks about how we aren't supposed to worry and how God will provide for us. I'm like, yes, that is a great passage to preach. That's probably like one of the best passages to preach in the Bible. But then a couple weeks later, Jeff came back to me. He's like, Scott, I counted wrong. You get the money passage. I'm like, I have to talk about money? I'm like, oh man, I don't want to be convicted about money. But it's been good. It's been a challenging sermon to read and to figure out God's heart on it. But it's been really, really, really good. So if we will start off by reading the passage here in Matthew chapter 6, verse 19 to 24. This is the passage today that we are going to go through. It says, do not store up yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moth and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are good, your whole body will be full of light. If your eyes are bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So when I read this verse, I feel like it's pretty straightforward. Like God kind of lays it out, Jesus kind of lays it out when he gives this sermon, that we get this idea that we're not supposed to store up treasures here on earth. And really the passage here, there isn't a whole lot, like I'm going to add some insights, but really the passage is saying what it's saying. There isn't like we need to dissect it and say, well, maybe he's not actually saying this. The passage here really is saying what it seems to be saying when we first read it. But we'll start off by reading, going through a little bit of Matthew 6, verse 19. That's the first verse up here. It says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. That's the first passage here. And Jesus tells us that storing up money and possessions on earth, it's a bad idea, right? He says that is a poor decision. A lot of times in youth we talk about making good decisions and poor decisions, and he says to store up wealth and treasures on this earth, that is a poor decision, right? That's what he says. And it kind of makes you ask the question is why does he say storing up money and possessions on earth is a poor decision? And I think the first reason why Jesus says this is treasure on earth is temporary, right? And that's kind of the point he makes here, where moths and rust, they destroy things of this world, right? Clothes wear out, vehicles, they will rust. Doesn't matter how many vehicles you buy, you're probably going to always have to, eventually they're going to rust and wear down, even if you drive like David Hyde's like little Toyota Camry there. That thing will die one day because of rust. Yeah, you say it won't, but it will, right? Everything in this world is going to wear out, right? If you go to IKEA and you buy some cabinets, they're going to wear out, right? Plain as day, they're not going to last very long at all, right? If you go to Crystal Cabinets, they might last 30, 40, 100 years longer, but they too will likely wear out. But, right, things of this earth, they are temporary, right? I think back to Christmas this year, I was really wanting a brand new golf bag. I'm like, yes, I want a new golf bag. Mine is getting old and gross and started to smell. I don't know how a golf bag smells, but it did. But I got this new golf bag for Christmas. But then I started to think, you know what? This is the third golf bag I've got for Christmas in my life already. And I'm 33 years old, right? I'm like, that is not a very good sign for these golf bags, right? Maybe I'm just hard on them. But if you think back to whatever maybe you got for Christmas or whatever you got over the years, you probably have asked for that before at some point in your life, right? Because things of this world, they just don't last, right? And Jesus says, if you're gonna store up wealth on this world, it's a poor decision because even what you have isn't gonna last. There's another verse here in James chapter 5 that says, now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you, and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded you have hoarded wealth in the last days. And James has given here some of the same thoughts that Matthew or Jesus has given us in the book of Matthew, right? He tells us that our stuff doesn't last forever, right? Your wealth has rotted, your moths have eaten your clothes, all this stuff, that your stuff is not going to last. And he makes this line here at the very end, you have hoarded wealth in the last days. And I think that is the heart of what we're going to be talking about here this morning, is that God doesn't want us hoarding our wealth. And I think that's a real important point there that James is making. The second reason maybe why it's a poor decision to store up money on this earth is because storing up money is intoxicating, right? Once we start storing up money, we kind of want to keep storing up money. We never are content with having what we have, right? We always want more, and this idea of money always wants us to have gathering money and storing money keeps us wanting more. There's a verse in 1 Timothy 6:10 that Michelle read there earlier. It says, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil." Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Right? Money can lead you down a very poor way away from God, right? It can lead us towards all sort of griefs. And it reminds me of the story of the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son goes to his dad and he says, "Give me your money," right? He says, I want my share of what is going to be mine one day, right? And he goes and he takes all this money and he squanders it and he has all this temporary fun, right? And he spends it and it seems like a good time for a while, right? But then when the time runs out, he's left there and he's alone and he's hungry and he ends up going back to his dad because this money didn't last. But this money caused him all sorts of griefs, right? And I think the trouble with storing up money, storing up treasures in this world, it's a little bit intoxicating. Is once you start, you don't know how to stop, and you keep wanting more and more and more. It's really hard to prioritize Jesus when our life is focused on accumulating stuff or money, right? And in Luke 18, it talks about Jesus' encounter with the rich young ruler, right? And he says, "One thing you lack, sell everything you have and give it to the poor," right? And then he goes and he makes this statement, and he says, how hard it is for a rich to enter the kingdom of heaven, right? It is hard for the rich to enter the kingdom of heaven because money gets in the way of us serving God, right? And he doesn't give that same warning to the poor. He gives that warning to the rich because rich have a harder time with money. I follow this Instagram account. I don't know why I'm talking about Instagram, but I follow this Instagram account called Preacher Sneakers. I don't know if you guys ever want to look it up, but basically this whole account, it goes through different preachers. I guess probably most of them are from the States, but probably is the same in Canada. But it takes a picture of the preacher preaching, and it takes a picture of his sneakers, and then it posts how much the preacher's sneakers cost, right? And it just kind of makes a statement. I'm not sure if this account is a Christian statement or an account or what, but they have these preachers that are preaching, and they have $1,000 brand name shirt on with, $1,500 shoes, and they'll have actual pictures of it. And it just reminds me that even as a speaker or as a pastor, I am not immune to having this desire of accumulating wealth, right? And when I look at that, every time I see that picture, it reminds me, Scott, man, it doesn't matter who you are in this world, we all have this temptation to want more and to be attracted to things on this earth. And I think that is really important to remember. So we'll go to the next verse here in Matthew 6, verse 20. Matthew 6, verse 20 says, "But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moss and rust do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal." So here, Jesus switches the focus to where it should be, right? We should be pursuing treasures in heaven, not treasures on this earth. So what does it mean to get treasures in heaven? Treasures in heaven means doing whatever is of good and eternal significance that comes from out of what is done on earth. So what we do on earth that it has eternal significance is what gets us treasures in heaven. So we're going to look at a few different ways to get treasures in heaven from this verse in 1 Timothy 6. This is Paul gives us a bit of a list here on how to accumulate treasures in heaven using money. This is how we use money to accumulate treasures in heaven. It says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, nor to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good and be rich in good deeds, and be generous and willing to share. In this way, they will lay up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation in the coming age, so they may take hold of life that is truly life. And I really like this idea of how we can get this list here. Paul has 4 different areas here where we can use money to accumulate treasures in heaven, right? It says, first of all, it says, do not be arrogant, right? It says, command those who are rich in this present world. So Paul is speaking to people who are currently rich. He says, you have a way of you can use this wealth to actually store up treasures in heaven. And he says, first of all, do not be arrogant. Just because you have money, don't look at yourselves as better than anybody else, right? He says, put yourself on the same playing field as everybody else. Command those in this present world who are rich not to be arrogant. Secondly, he says, not to put their hope in wealth, right? We just talked about how wealth and material things, they are temporary. They do not last. They go away, they fade, and they won't be here forever, right? And it's a very poor place to put your hope in something that cannot last. I think in that Matthew passage there, it says how where thieves can break in and steal, right? People can literally come into your home. I don't know if you guys know this, but I had my shoes stolen actually back in November. I don't know what month it was, but one night me and Courtney were sleeping, and we both had a pair of shoes sitting by the door, and we woke up the next morning and both of our shoes are gone. Pairs of shoes are gone. And good thing they weren't expensive shoes. But it's just like what you have can be taken from you, right? You can ask Milk Cron about that. He's had experience with that. But it's a poor place to put your hope in wealth because it's temporary, right? We need to put our hope in places that last. And we put our hope in places that will last in God, it will actually bring us treasures in heaven. If he keeps going on there, he says, command them to do good and be rich in good deeds. That's a third way that we can use our money to get us riches in heaven. To do good and be rich in good deeds. Use our money in a very godly manner. And the last one is be generous and willing to share. Recognizing that what you have has been given to you, right? Sometimes I feel like I have earned what I have. I have earned everything that I have, but really what I have is a gift from God, right? And we should use that and be generous and be willing to share that with those around us. God has entrusted us with this gift of wealth or a gift of money so that we may use it in a godly manner. So these are 4 ways that we can use money to store up treasures in heaven. But there's also a way of storing up treasures in heaven without using money. Right? We don't need money to store up treasures in heaven. This passage here in Matthew 6 isn't talking just about using money to accumulate treasures in heaven. But we've been reading all the way through the Sermon on the Mount here, where it's talking about different ways to use how we live to store up treasures in heaven. So this one here is in Matthew 5, right after the Beatitudes. Jesus says, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and then falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Right? So Jesus says, when we endure persecution, when we go through hard times, even when people are saying false things about us, we can use that to bring rewards for ourselves in heaven, right? And that really has nothing to do with how we're using our money. It's about talking about how we live our lives. And then there's a passage a little bit later in Matthew 5:46 that says, but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? So Jesus says you don't get rewards for loving people that love you, but it implies that you get rewards from God when we love people who we don't tend to want to love, right? When we love our enemies. And that's another way of rewarding ourselves in heaven. Pray secretly in your room. Matthew 6, verse 6 says, but when you go to your room, close the door and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And you kind of see these things go all the way through the scriptures. He says if you live a certain way, it isn't really even limited to this list. There's all sorts of different ways of being faithful to your spouse or not lying, that we can build up rewards for us in heaven. And another one Jesus uses in Matthew 10:42 says, if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, I truly tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward in heaven. And it's another way of how we live our lives. It really actually matters. We have a way to live a life that doesn't store up treasures for ourselves on earth, that we can live in a way that stores up treasures for an eternity. Right? And we don't always view life this way. We don't view life that my actions have an eternal significance. They don't just matter today. They can matter for literally eternity. There's another verse here in 2 Corinthians 4:17-18. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what's unseen is eternal. And there's this way of living that can actually achieve for us this eternal glory, right? If we live in a certain way, it can have eternal significance. And it reminds me of like I don't know if you guys are in debt like me, but I'm in a little bit of debt just with like my mortgage on my house and stuff. But like when you like go to make a mortgage payment, it's easy just to like make a normal payment, right? And if you make a normal payment, you will make all your payments in normal plan. You will end the whole mortgage when it's deadline to end, right? But if you actually pay extra early, the more you pay early, it doesn't just like get you off that much earlier. You save yourself that much more interest, and then you get out of the mortgage even like I think it's up to twice as fast based on what you give early, right? And it's kind of like it's so easy to live in a way and just make your normal mortgage payments, right? But when you actually think about it, it will be way more beneficial to pay off as much as you possibly can early, because it will pay off in twofold later on in that. And that's kind of, I always think in my life, I generally live in the here and now. I live in like what I need to do here and now, but I think a lot of times God's saying, don't think about the here and now. Don't just live your life for like rewards now or just like momentary ease. Live in a way that has eternal significance. Think down the road, right? You won't always be on this earth. One day you're going to leave and you won't be able to accumulate these treasures in heaven anymore. And I like that kind of this picture of like this mortgage, because like I don't think like paying off now, it might help me down the road, but I don't really realize sometimes the benefits of like trying to help myself out down the road, right? And I think that's kind of what God is getting at here, where he's like, you know what, live in this way now so you will have rewards later on. And I don't know about you guys, but when I think about rewards in heaven, I don't think sometimes they're real. I think like, everybody gets it the same in heaven, right? We're going to get to heaven one day, and it's all going to be the same for everybody. But I think there is legitimacy in thinking that these rewards in heaven, they will actually change they literally talk about treasure and rewards and crowns, and like there's these physical rewards in heaven. And I don't know, I think Jeff mentioned to me, he's like, I'm not sure that life in heaven will be the same for everybody. I think I don't know how to think about it properly in a theological manner, but I think there are real rewards in heaven, and I don't think about that in my everyday life. I think there's a verse in Revelation that says, "Then I heard a voice say from heaven, write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." And there is this idea that our deeds will follow us, and how we live and how we use our money will actually have everlasting significance. And it's not to say that we are saved by works and how we use our money gets us to heaven. That is not at all what I want to preach. This is not a works-based religion, right? We are saved by grace, but there is something to the idea of living in a way that we use our money and we use our lives to gain reward in heaven. So I don't know, I think that strikes me a lot when I read this passage in Matthew 6. Verse 21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I usually read this passage to mean if I have my heart in the right place, my money will follow it. If I have my money or my heart aligned with God, I will give, I will do all my living according to where my heart is at. But actually, if you think about it, this passage is saying the opposite. It says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's a little bit backwards from the way I generally think about it. We usually think about this in the opposite way than the way it's actually written, or than the way Jesus said it. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And I was thinking about how this actually maybe plays out this way in our everyday lives. And I don't know, for a little while there, I got into I never really got into it, but I started being interested in the stock market. I'm like, this sounds like an easy way to make money. Just put some money in some stocks and they grow, and then you sell them, and that sounds like a great way to make money, but it didn't work out that way. Anyways, but I think that's kind of I used to always just look at stocks every day. I'm like, oh, that one looks like it's doing good, that one's doing good. And it was kind of fun to look. Then all of a sudden one day, I'm like, I actually took the plunge and I bought one stock, or a bunch of shares in one stock. And I'm like, now I check this thing 3 times a day, right? And I'm like, oh man, how's it doing today? Oh, it's down again, shoot. But it's kind of where my treasure was. All of a sudden, my heart just followed, right? I'm like, I never really cared about this stock until I invested in the stock, and I'm checking it multiple times a day, and it really my heart followed, and it didn't matter which stock I picked. Whichever stock I would have picked, I would have been oh man, that my heart would have went there, right? And I think that really implies the same thing, but in a positive way, right? If we spend our money, and I say, man, I really want to invest in this home for Juan that we're fundraising for, and I want to pour my resources and what God's given me into building Juan a home in Mexico. Man, my heart is going to reach out for Juan. It's going to be man, I'm going to be even more invested because my treasure has went there, and my heart will follow along with it, right? I don't think we need to wait for our heart to catch up to know where we should give. If I know that this is a good thing and I have resources, I should pour my resources there, and and my heart will just come along with, right? And I think that's a good analogy of how our heart sometimes needs help with our giving. We don't always need to expect our heart to be ahead of our giving. The point that Jesus is making, this isn't just limited to money either, right? God wants our money, He wants our resources, but it isn't just limited to money. We can highly treasure honor or pleasure or other material different things in life. And the point is we need to be careful where our treasure is. Because where our treasure really matters, because our heart will be going along with our treasure. Next verse is Matthew 6, 22 to 23. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? And I think these verses just kind of speak for themselves. It's pretty standard stuff. Just kidding. No, I find these verses probably the most complicated in the passage, right? I read these verses and I'm like, man, I'm sure Jeff is next door because I have no clue what these verses are talking about. But in the beginning here, we need to understand that Jesus talks about eyes in ways that don't quite make sense to us, right? In the beginning of verse 22 there, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. Almost like everybody who's listening to Jesus understands that the eye is the lamp of the body. Isn't that obvious? The eye, don't you guys all know that the eye is the lamp of the body? I didn't know that, right? But I think Jesus in his time, they read this in a way that this is normal, right? In ancient times, the world would view the human eye as like a window which a light would shine through, right? So in ancient times, the world saw this human eye as a window in which light would shine through and let light into the body. And just like the window here lets in light, is they would view that window that letting in light is the same as an eye that would let light into the body, right? And if you have darkness in your body, that means your eye is focused on very poor things. And if you have light in your body, that means your eye is focused on really good things. And I think the point here that Jesus is trying to make is what we long for and what we see or what we long for really, really matters, right? Do we long for rewards of man? This is following just these rewards and storing up treasure passages. But do we long for the rewards of man, or do we long for the rewards of God? Right? And he makes this illustration with the eye that we don't totally understand because we don't really talk as the eye is a window to the body. But what we long for with our eyes really does matter. And it reminds me of that passage in, I think it's in Matthew 5 where Jeff was talking about how, like, if a man looks at a woman with lust, then he should gouge out his eyes. But how, like, your eyes have a way of, like, filtering, and what they long for has a way of, like, changing how your whole body. And I think Jesus is making this statement here that we need to be careful on what we long for. Where do we set our heart on? Are we setting our eyes on the things of God or the things of man? Verse 24. Matthew 6:24 says, "No one can serve two masters. Either he will hate one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." And I think the important thing to think about in this verse is Jesus, he's using slavery language. Jesus is making, I think people, when they hear these, back in Jesus' time, they would hear this as no one can serve two masters. They would immediately have reference to slavery, right? Because slavery was very prominent in Jesus' time, and they would read like, oh yeah, that's obvious, you can't serve two masters. When I read that, I'm like, oh, you can't serve two employers. And I'm like, kind of. You kind of can. You can have two jobs at once, and you can serve this master when you're at, or this employer when you're at this job, and you can serve this employer when you're at this job. But that's not really what Jesus is saying, right? Jesus is saying that you are a slave, and a slave owner, when you have a slave owner, you can only serve one. You can't serve two at the same time. And Jesus is making this point with God and money. And so this year, I've been coaching basketball, and this, for the first time in a while, I am not the head coach of the basketball team. I'm coaching at the high school. And I came in this year, and we have a head coach, and it's a little bit different when you're coaching with somebody else. I maybe used to coaching more by myself. But sometimes during the game, we have one of our players out there, and the coach will be at one end of the bench, and I'm at this end of the bench, and we're both shouting instructions. I don't realize actually how much I yell until I'm at a basketball game, and I'm coaching. I'm I feel like I'm not like Brett. I don't yell like Brett does. But I get to the game, and I'm just yelling out instructions the whole time, do this, do that, run over there. And all of a sudden, I hear one of my players get the ball, and I'm shoot, and my other coach is pass. And we look at each other, we're I don't know. And the kid's super confused because they have no clue what to do because they got these two coaches on the bench yelling at them to do opposite things, right? And I think, literally the kid, he's frozen because he doesn't know what to do. Does he listen to this coach, listen to that coach? Well, she's the head coach. He's just a helper. So I'll listen to her. I'll shoot. And anyways, the point is that kid can't do both of what we're asking, right? He has two different voices yelling at him to do two different things, but he can only do one. And that's kind of how it is with God and money. We can't serve, it says so clearly here, you cannot serve both God and money, right? We serve one or we serve the other one. And we think sometimes we can cut it down the middle and we can do a bit of both. I'll serve God today in this way and I'll serve money this way. It's not really that big a deal, but if we can't play down the middle. You kind of have to pick a side. Jesus says you are going to be a slave, but it's up to you who you will serve, God or money. There's no way out of being a slave. We're going to be a slave either way, but either we're a slave to money or we're going to be a slave to God. And I think it's important to remember that when Jesus is preaching this sermon, he's preaching to a crowd of people, but he's also at the same time preaching to his disciples, right? So there's kind of two different circles of people, right? He has his inner circle of people, like his disciples that have chosen that I'm going to follow him. And then there's this outer circle of crowds who are just kind of following him and listening, and they haven't really decided whether or not I'm going to serve this God, right? They're not they're not really in. They haven't decided, they haven't made this choice that I'm going to follow Jesus. So Jesus doesn't really totally expect them to live this way. But for his disciples, this inner circle of people that he's speaking to, that have chosen that I am going to follow the way of Jesus and of God, there are some important choices that need to be made for these people, right? And that's the choice that I probably find myself in the same spot, right? If we are followers of Jesus, we must choose. Where does my reward come from? Where do I want my future rewards to be? What should my eye be on? Right? These questions we need to answer if we've decided to follow Jesus. We make a decision on these things. And I read an illustration that it's like there's two temples across the street from each other, right? And one has a cross on it, and one has a money sign on it, right? And we have to choose which spot we are going to serve. We can't enter both temples, right? We got to pick which one we are gonna follow. And one of the things that I love about this church over the years, I feel like I'm up here a lot, maybe for mission trips or whatever, but I'm always asking for money. And we're fundraising for this, we're fundraising for that. These kids are going here and they need your money or support. And I've found over the years that this church has been an extremely generous church. And I have been extremely thankful for how this church has a heart to give. And I find myself very encouraged by so many of you in this church who have lived out this calling in Matthew, right? To give out of the resources that you have had. But I want to encourage us and encourage myself to not be content with where we're at. How can we use our resources to further God's kingdom in this world? This last week, we had an elder retreat. We went to the new Best Western there in Morden, and we had all sorts of good discussions throughout the week, and we had all sorts. I had a speaker come in, and it was really awesome. And the last day, we asked ourselves the question, what is our vision for Cornerstone? And we asked the question, what if money wasn't an issue? What if we had unlimited resources? What is our vision? What could God do in this community? And I love that question because I think it kind of focuses on this treasures in heaven. How can we use what we have now? If money isn't an issue, how can we use what we have to further your kingdom, God's kingdom on this earth? And we had all sorts of different ideas come out of that discussion, and some of them I'm really, really excited about moving forward with. But just this idea of how can we use what we have to bless what God has given us and the people around us, and how can we use it in a way that gets us treasure, not it's for us, but how can we use it for God that has literally eternal significance? And that's kind of where my heart is at a lot with this. And I really like this idea of us being a church that is willing to use what we have to do what's on God's heart. So if God is our master, how can we use the money God has given us to build his kingdom, not our own? And I want to encourage you to not just use your money, but all areas of your life to earn eternal rewards, not just rewards that are of this world. So I'm going to close.